Chapter 1. The air in Ton Hoa was thick enough to drink. It was a humid, soupy mixture of diesel fumes, wet earth, and the cloying sweetness of jasmine, a scent Emma Nguyen had forgotten she hated. It clung to her clothes, her skin, the back of her throat. For 8 years in the sterile, air-conditioned world of Chicago, she had curated a life devoid of such sensory assaults. Now, it was all rushing back, a tidal wave of memories she had fought hard to suppress. Her taxi, a vintage Toyota with more rust than paint, rattled over the pockmarked road, its suspension groaning in protest. The driver, a man in his 40s with a sardonic glint in his eyes and a toothpick dancing on his lips, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Not much to see out here, Emma," he said, his voice a gravelly mix of Vietnamese and English learned from tourists. "Just rice paddies, banyan trees, and ghosts." He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "You sure this is the right place? Ton Hoa Morgue is where things end, not where they begin." "I'm sure," Emma said, her voice tighter than she intended. She stared out the window, past her own pale reflection at the endless green. The rice paddies were vast, hypnotic sheets of emerald, shrouded in a low-hanging fog that blurred the line between earth and sky. Towering over them, like ancient, gnarled sentinels, were the banyan trees. Their aerial roots hung like tangled gray hair, twisting down to touch the soil, creating shadowy archways that seemed to lead nowhere. Her grandmother, Banagwai, used to say that spirits rested in the branches of banyan trees, watching the world of the living. Superstition, Emma reminded herself, the word a familiar shield. Folklore for scaring children, but it was her grandmother's stories that had brought her here. Banagwai, a woman who had seemed as timeless as the banyan trees themselves, was dead. The official report from the local police was a masterclass in bureaucratic vagueness, an unfortunate incident at her place of work. Accidental death. Case closed. Her place of work, they'd said, was the Ton Hoa Morgue. Emma couldn't fathom it. Her grandmother had been a weaver of traditional textiles, her hands always smelling of indigo and star anise, not formaldehyde. The taxi slowed, turning onto a narrow, unpaved lane. The banyan trees crowded in, their branches forming a dense canopy that plunged the road into premature twilight. The air grew cooler, heavier. And then she saw it, the Ton Hoa Morgue was a relic, a cancerous growth on the landscape. It was a 2-story colonial French structure, its once white stucco walls now stained a sickly yellow-gray, peeling back to reveal crumbling brick beneath. Dark green shutters hung askew from arched windows, like tired, weeping eyes. A wrought iron fence, rusted and bent, encircled the property, failing to keep the encroaching jungle at bay. The place didn't just look abandoned, it looked diseased. "Here we are," the driver, Tuan, announced with a theatrical sigh. "End of the line. You want me to wait? The storms are coming in tonight. No grab out here." "Just for a little while, thank you," Emma said, her journalist's instincts wrestling with a primal urge to tell him to turn around and drive back to Hanoi, back to the airport, back to the rational world she knew. She paid him, the Vietnamese dong feeling foreign in her hands. As her boots crunched on the gravel path leading to the entrance, the morgue's heavy wooden door creaked open. A young woman in a pale blue medical tunic stood silhouetted in the doorway. She was slender, with wide, nervous eyes that darted from Emma to the darkening sky. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm Emma Nguyen. I'm here about my grandmother, Lone Teen Nguyen." The young woman's face paled. "Ah. You are the granddaughter from America." She wrung her hands, a gesture of pure anxiety. "I am Lin. A medical intern. Please, come in. It is about to rain." Emma stepped inside, and the world outside vanished. The air within was frigid, an unnatural cold that had nothing to do with air conditioning and everything to do with stone and silence. The smell was overwhelming, a sharp, chemical bite of formaldehyde layered over a deeper, mustier scent of decay and damp earth. A single long hallway stretched before her, lit by fluorescent tubes that flickered and buzzed like dying insects. The floors were cracked linoleum, the walls the same peeling yellow as the exterior. To her left, a set of double doors bore a metal sign in Vietnamese, Phinh Gphu, autopsy room. Mr. Min is in the office, Lin said, gesturing down the hall. He is the one who manages this place. He was here when it happened. Before Emma could respond, a man emerged from a doorway at the end of the hall. He was older than Tuan, perhaps in his mid-30s, with a stocky build and a face set in a permanent scowl. His eyes, dark and weary, appraised Emma with an open dislike that took her aback. "You're the journalist," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I am Min. There is nothing for you here. Your grandmother's death was an accident. Go home." "I'm not leaving until I get some real answers," Emma countered, her own defenses rising. What kind of accident? Why was she even working here? Min let out a harsh, bitter laugh. She wasn't working here. She was a consultant. A consultant for what? Weaving shrouds? For the dead, Min said, his voice dropping low. She helped the spirits rest easy. A service this place desperately needs. He stared at her, his gaze intense. A service you Americans, with your science and your skepticism, cannot understand. A loud crack of thunder shook the building, making the lights flicker violently. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. From the parking lot, Emma heard a shout. "Tuan!" She hurried to the door and peered out. The sky had turned a bruised purple-black. Rain was lashing down in sheets, turning the gravel path into a muddy river. Tuan was struggling with the hood of his taxi, shouting curses into the wind. "My engine's flooded," he yelled, soaked to the bone. "It's dead. Get inside." Emma called out, waving him in. He needed no second invitation, dashing through the deluge and stumbling into the morgue, dripping water all over the linoleum. "Troy oi," he gasped, shaking his head. "A storm from hell." As if on cue, a deafening clang echoed through the building. It was a sound of immense finality, of metal striking metal. A series of secondary, heavy thuds followed from down the hall and upstairs. Lin let out a small, terrified squeak. "Oh no. No, no, no. What was that?" Tuan asked, his bravado washed away by the rain. Min's face was ashen, his usual scowl replaced by stark terror. "The lockdown," he whispered. "The storm must have triggered the old emergency system. It seals the building. The doors, they won't open until sunrise." Emma's heart hammered against her ribs. "What do you mean, they won't open?" "There has to be a manual override." Min shook his head slowly, his eyes wide with a fear that went beyond being merely trapped. "This is Ton Hoa Morgue. The system is old. The rules are older." He looked from Emma's disbelieving face to Tuan's panicked one, then to Lin, who was trembling. "We are locked in. Until dawn. And it's almost midnight." Chapter 2, Panic is a cold, sharp thing. It pierced the humid air of the morgue, cutting through Emma's journalistic detachment. Tuan was already at the main door, pulling on the heavy iron handle with all his might, his grunts echoing in the sudden, tomb-like silence. The door didn't budge. "He's right," Tuan panted, turning to face them, his face slick with a mixture of rain and sweat. "It's solid. There has to be a breaker box, a control panel," Emma insisted, her mind racing, searching for a logical solution, a foothold of rationality in a situation that was rapidly losing its sanity. "There is," Min said, his voice flat and devoid of hope. "But it's in the director's old office. And it is tied to the clock. It will not respond before 6 a.m. "This is insane," Emma breathed, running a hand through her damp hair. "Why would a morgue have a system like this? Because of what's inside, Min said grimly. He gestured for them to follow him, his feet shuffling reluctantly toward the small office from which he'd first emerged. The office was cramped, dominated by a large, metal desk and filing cabinets that were bleeding rust. The air was stale with the smell of old paper and cigarette smoke. On the wall, a yellowed clock ticked with agonizing slowness. 11:52 p.m. Min walked over to a tall, narrow cabinet in the corner. He fumbled with a key, his hands shaking slightly, and opened it. He didn't retrieve a tool or a set of blueprints. Instead, he carefully lifted out a long, rolled-up object wrapped in oilcloth that he placed it on the desk and unrolled it with a reverence that seemed entirely out of place. It was a scroll of thick, parchment-like paper, its edges brittle and dark, as if charred. But it wasn't charring. Emma leaned closer, her stomach churning. The dark stains were blood. Old, dried blood, written on the scroll in elegant, sweeping strokes of black ink was Vietnamese script. It was a list, numbered 1 through 5. What is this? Emma asked, her voice hushed. The rules, Min said. The only things that matter between midnight and sunrise. He looked at them, his eyes begging them to understand. 5 years ago, I had a partner. His name was Bao. He was like you, he said, nodding at Emma. He thought all this was foolishness. He laughed at the stories. One night, a night just like this, we were trapped. The lockdown. Min paused, swallowing hard. The only sound was the ticking of the clock. Bao got spooked, he continued. He thought he saw something in the shadows. He ran down to the basement, to the cold storage units. He wanted to make sure everything was secure. I told him not to go. But he didn't listen. He broke a rule. A simple one. He didn't mean to. Lin, who had been silent until now, wrapped her arms around herself. What happened to him, on Min? Min's gaze was distant, haunted. We found him in the morning. In the basement, which had flooded from the rain. He was floating face down in a foot of water. The coroner said he drowned. But his lungs, they were dry. There was not a drop of water in them. Something had scared him to death. Something that came from the water. He tapped a trembling finger on the first line of the scroll. Rule number 1, he read, his voice a hoarse whisper. Dung nin veo mat nuoi chet. Do not look into the eyes of the dead. Emma stared at the script, then back at Min. And you expect me to believe that looking at a corpse's eyes will kill you? No, Min said, his voice dangerously low. I expect you to believe that it allows a Han Ma, a wandering soul, to latch onto you. It shows you a vision of your own death. And it calls for the Mada, the river ghost. The thing that killed Bao. It will hunt you through water, through any reflection, until it can drag you into its world. Tuan let out a nervous laugh. Mada? My grandmother used to tell me stories about them to keep me from the river at night. It's a fairy tale. Then let's hope you don't have to learn otherwise, Min snapped. He pointed to the next rule. Rule number 2, Dung noi ten nuoi chet sao nua dem. Never speak the names of the dead after midnight. To do so calls their spirit back with a hunger. It turns them into a Quang Ti. A hopping vampire? Emma said, the skepticism thick in her voice. Really? They are not a joke, Min insisted, his face grim. They are corpses animated by rage, and they will hunt the one who spoke their name relentlessly. He moved down the list. 3. Je qua tat ca kak qua sao 1 geo sang. Keep all doors locked after 1 a.m. An unlocked door is an invitation. For what, I do not know for sure, but the old texts call them Kui Nap Trang, spirits that possess and merge the dead. Lin made a small gasping sound, her medical training warring with the primal fear in her eyes. 4, Dung Cham Veo Soi Chi Du Tren Bat Kai Zak Now. Do not touch the red thread on any corpse. Some bodies here, they are different. They are bound. The thread is a seal. Breaking it unleashes a Ma Kui, a true demon, that plays with shadows and your mind. His finger rested on the final rule. His voice was barely audible. And 5. Never, ever, turn off the morgue's main light. The one in the autopsy room. It is a ward. It keeps the horde at bay. To turn it off is to invite them all in at once. It is to invite madness. The clock on the wall began to chime. 12 deep, sonorous bongs that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the building. Midnight. A heavy silence fell over the room. The storm raged outside, a symphony of wind and rain. Inside, it felt as if the morgue itself was holding its breath. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was absurd. All of it. Ghosts, hopping vampires, demons. It was the 21st century. She was a journalist. She dealt in facts, in evidence. But as she looked at Min's terrified face and Lin's trembling form, a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, lodged itself in her heart. My grandmother, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. The report said there was an associate of hers who died in the same incident. Where is his body? Min looked at her, his expression grim. He is in cold storage unit 7. In the basement. But you will not go there. You will not tempt fate. I'm not tempting fate, Emma said, her resolve hardening. This was what she came for. Answers. I'm investigating. I need to see the body. I need to see if there are any clues about what happened to my grandmother. She grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from a shelf, its beam cutting a clean, rational circle in the dim light. I'm not afraid of your ghost stories, Min. That is what Bao said, Min whispered as she walked out of the office. That is exactly what he said. Chapter 3, the door to the basement groaned in protest as Emma pushed it open, revealing a set of steep concrete stairs descending into darkness. The air that rose to meet her was a fresh kind of foul, a damp, earthy rot that clung to the ever-present chemical smell. It was the smell of a place that flooded often. This is a bad idea, Tuan said from behind her, his voice echoing slightly in the stairwell. He was holding another flashlight, its beam dancing nervously over the wet stone walls. Lin followed him, looking like a lamb being led to slaughter. Stay up here if you want, Emma said, not breaking her stride. I need to do this. Min had remained in the office, a silent, disapproving statue. But the other two, bound by either a reluctant sense of duty or the simple fear of being left alone, had followed. The basement was a labyrinth of concrete corridors and dripping pipes. Puddles of murky water stood on the floor, perfectly still, reflecting the flashlight beams like black mirrors. The walls were lined with the doors to the cold storage units, heavy, stainless steel rectangles numbered with black stencils. Unit 7, Emma said, her breath misting in the cold air. They found it at the end of a long, narrow corridor. A faint, rhythmic dripping sound echoed from somewhere nearby, a maddeningly steady beat in the oppressive silence. The handle to the unit was cold and stiff. Emma had to put her shoulder into it to pull the heavy door open. A wave of intensely cold air washed over them, carrying with it the faint, sickly sweet scent of human decay. Inside, a single slab held a body shrouded in a white sheet. This was it. The key to understanding what happened to Banagwai. Okay, stand back, Emma said, her voice all business. She was a professional again. This was a scene. She needed to document it. She took a deep breath and pulled back the sheet. The man was middle-aged, his face slack, his skin a waxy, gray color. There were no obvious signs of trauma. No wounds, no bruises she could see. He looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Nothing, Tuan muttered. He just looks dead. No, Emma whispered, leaning closer. Her flashlight beam traced the lines of his face, his neck, his chest. She was looking for anything the local police might have missed. A needle mark. A ligature mark. A defensive wound. Her mind was so focused on the clinical details, on the rational, observable facts, that she forgot the warning. She forgot the rule. Her gaze drifted upward, from his chest to his neck, to his chin, and then, she met his eyes. They were open. Just a fraction. A dull, milky sheen of cornea visible beneath heavy lids. She had been a journalist for 6 years. She had seen dead bodies before. In photos, at crime scenes. It was a part of the job. You disassociated. You looked, but you didn't see. This time, she saw, for a split second that stretched into an eternity, the morgue, the basement, the cold, all of it dissolved. She was no longer standing on a concrete floor but was submerged in icy, black water. The pressure was immense, crushing the air from her lungs. Panic, pure and primal, seized her. She couldn't breathe. Her arms flailed, finding nothing but the suffocating liquid void. She opened her mouth to scream, but the water rushed in, a torrent of freezing silt and decay filling her throat, her lungs. And in the crushing darkness, she saw a face rise up to meet her. Her own. Bloated, blue, with eyes wide in a silent, eternal scream, Emma. Lynn's shriek ripped her from the vision. Emma stumbled back, gasping, choking, clawing at her throat as if to expel the phantom water. She collapsed against the corridor wall, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She was drenched in sweat, yet she felt freezing cold. What happened? Tuan demanded, rushing to her side. You look like you've seen a ghost. Emma couldn't answer. She could only gasp for air, the vision seared onto the inside of her eyelids that it was just a vision, she tried to tell herself. A panic attack. Stress. Grief, but then Lynn screamed again, a high, piercing shriek of absolute terror. She wasn't looking at Emma. She was pointing down the corridor, her flashlight beam shaking violently. The water, she cried. Look at the water. Emma forced her head up. She followed Lynn's trembling light. The puddle in the middle of the hall, the one that had been still and black just moments before, was no longer still. The surface was rippling. Not from the dripping pipe, but from the center, as if something were about to break the surface from below. The reflection it cast was distorted, warped. Emma could see her own face in it, but it was the face from her vision, blue, bloated, drowned out. A low gurgling sound bubbled up from the puddle, a sound like water being forced through a rotten throat. The smell hit them next, not formaldehyde or decay, but the pungent, foul stench of stagnant river mud and dead things. Slowly, impossibly, a hand emerged from the center of the foot-deep puddle that it was skeletal, the bones coated in a thin, translucent layer of gray skin that dripped with black, brackish water. Long, stringy weeds clung to its wrist like bracelets. The fingers, tipped with yellowed, jagged nails, clawed at the air, stretching, reaching. Another hand followed, then a head. The face was a nightmare. The flesh was sloughed off in places, revealing the pale, grinning bone of the skull beneath. Its eyes were empty sockets, yet they seemed to fixate on Emma, filled with an ancient, hungry intelligence. Water and black sludge streamed from its lipless mouth as it pulled its emaciated, dripping torso out of the puddle, its spine cracking and popping with each unnatural movement. The Mada, for a second, nobody moved. They were frozen, their minds refusing to process the horror unfolding before them. It was impossible. It defied every law of physics, of biology, of sanity. Then the creature opened its mouth and released a sound, a high, keening wail that was both a sob and a threat. It began to drag itself across the concrete floor toward them, its skeletal fingers scraping against the ground, leaving wet, muddy tracks. The spell broke. Run! Tuan bellowed, grabbing Lin's arm and hauling her back the way they came. Emma scrambled to her feet, her legs feeling like lead. Her mind was a whirlwind of terror and denial. Not real, not real, not real. But the scraping sound was real. The smell of the grave was real. The chilling wail echoing behind her was real. They sprinted down the corridor, their footsteps splashing in the puddles, their flashlight beams bouncing wildly off the concrete walls. Emma risked a glance over her shoulder. The Maada was faster than it looked, pulling itself along with a horrifying speed, its wet form seeming to glide over the damp floor. It was gaining on them. This way! Tuan yelled, veering into a side corridor filled with old equipment and discarded gurneys. It was a maze. They took a sharp right, then a left, the wail of the Maada seeming to come from all directions at once. They burst into a larger room, a disused laundry facility. Old, industrial washing machines stood like silent metal tombs. The floor here was almost entirely covered in an inch of standing water. Reflections were everywhere. In the water on the floor, in the glass doors of the machines, in a large, cracked mirror hanging on the far wall. No, Lin whimpered, her eyes wide with terror. Reflections. Min said, they were surrounded by portals. The scraping sound stopped. The wailing ceased. There was only the sound of their own ragged breathing and the steady drip, drip, drip of water from the ceiling. Where did it go? Tuan whispered, panning his light across the room. Emma saw it first. Not in the room with them, but in a reflection. In the cracked mirror on the wall, the creature was standing right behind her. She spun around, a scream catching in her throat. There was nothing there. She looked back at the mirror. The reflection of the Maada smiled, a gruesome twisting of exposed bone and decaying flesh. It raised a skeletal hand. Its reflection did so in perfect sync. But then, as its real-world counterpart remained unseen, the reflected hand reached out of the mirror. Gray, dripping fingers emerged from the glass, which rippled like water. The creature was pulling itself through the reflection, its form distorting as it squeezed through the portal of the mirror. Lin screamed and threw a rusty pipe wrench she'd snatched from the floor. It sailed through the space where the creature should have been and clattered against the far wall. The Maada, half in and half out of the mirror, was insubstantial, a ghost of a ghost, but then its feet touched the water on the floor of the room, and with a final, sickening squelch, it solidified. It was fully there, standing between them and the only exit. It let out another gurgling wail and began to advance, its empty sockets fixed on Emma. It was her. It wanted her. She had looked into the eyes of the dead. She had been marked. Panic gave way to a surge of adrenaline. There was no escape. They were cornered. Tuan shoved Lin behind him, holding his flashlight like a club. It was a futile gesture, and they all knew it. Then Emma's eyes landed on a large, red metal box on the wall. A fire alarm. Next to it, a large, canvas fire hose, coiled and ready. An idea, desperate and insane, sparked in her mind. Tuan. The hose, she screamed. He didn't question her. He was a man of action, and any action was better than waiting to die. While the Maada was focused on Emma, Tuan scrambled to the wall, wrestling with the valve. The creature lunged, its bony fingers reaching for Emma's face. She threw herself sideways, slipping on the wet floor and crashing into one of the washing machines. Her head struck metal, and her vision swam with stars. The stench of the river filled her senses. She heard a roar as Tuan finally twisted the valve open. A powerful jet of water erupted from the hose, hitting the Maada square in the chest. The effect was instantaneous and bizarre. The creature didn't recoil. It absorbed the water. Its desiccated form seemed to swell, its skin growing tighter, its movements becoming faster, stronger. It let out a triumphant shriek. They had given it exactly what it wanted. They had fed it. This isn't working. Tuan yelled over the roar of the water. The Mada, now invigorated, swatted the hose aside. It moved toward Emma, who was still struggling to clear her head. This was it. The vision. The drowning. It was coming true, but as the creature reached for her, its fingers inches from her throat, Lynn did something unexpected. The terrified, anxious medical student acted. She grabbed a heavy steel bucket filled with caustic cleaning powder, salt-based, for scrubbing grime, and hurled its contents with all her might. The white powder showered the Mada. A sound like 1,000 insects sizzling on a fire filled the room. The creature convulsed violently, smoke pouring from its wet skin where the powder touched it. It was like throwing salt on a slug, magnified 1,000 times. The salt was desiccating it, fighting its watery nature. It shrieked, a sound of pure agony this time, and stumbled backward, its form flickering, destabilizing. It staggered back into the large puddle in the center of the room, the very one it had used to strengthen itself. But now, contaminated with the salt-based cleaner, the water had become its poison. The creature thrashed, its body seeming to dissolve, to melt back into the water, which hissed and steamed as if boiling. In a final, desperate act, it lunged, not at them, but at its own reflection in the water. It plunged its hands, then its head, into its own murky portal. With a final, gurgling sigh, it was gone. The puddle fell still. The hissing stopped. The room was silent, save for the sound of the discarded fire hose still gushing water onto the floor. Tuan, his face pale, stumbled over and shut it off. For a long moment, the three of them stood there, chests heaving, covered in water and white powder, staring at a simple puddle on the floor. Emma pushed herself up, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her skepticism, her rational, ordered world, lay in shattered pieces around her. Min was right. The stories were true. The rules were real, and she had just broken the first one. For more remained, and the sun was still hours away. Chapter 4. The ascent from the basement was like rising from a grave. Each concrete step was a monumental effort, a climb back towards a world that no longer felt safe or sane. Emma's clothes were soaked, a disgusting cocktail of grimy floodwater and the chemical sting of the cleaning powder. Her head throbbed where she'd hit the washing machine, but the physical pain was a dull anchor in a sea of swirling, psychological trauma. They emerged into the main hallway to find Min standing exactly where they had left him, outside his office. He held the blood-stained scroll in one hand, his knuckles white. The look on his face wasn't one of triumph or, "I told you so." It was one of profound, soul-deep sorrow. He saw their sodden, trembling forms, the white powder dusting their clothes, the sheer terror in their eyes, and he simply nodded, a slow, grim acceptance of the inevitable. "The Mada," he said. It wasn't a question. Emma could only nod back, her throat too tight for words. Tuan, however, found his voice. It was raw, stripped of its usual sarcastic armor. "It came out of a puddle, Min." "A puddle? How is that possible?" "It does not come from the water," Min said, his voice a low monotone, as if reciting a catechism of dread. "It comes through the water. Any reflection is a doorway once you have been marked. You were lucky. Salt. An old remedy. It purifies, it burns what is unholy and wet." He looked pointedly at Emma. "You looked, didn't you?" "It was an accident," she whispered, the words feeling flimsy and pathetic. "The spirits do not care about intent," Min said, rolling up the scroll with funereal slowness. "They only care about the rules." They retreated into the cramped office, the four of them filling the small space with a palpable atmosphere of fear. Lynn had not spoken a word since her single, desperate act of bravery in the laundry room. She sat on a worn vinyl chair, shivering uncontrollably, her eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. Her mind, so dedicated to the logical certainties of medicine and pathology, had been shattered against the impossible reality of what she had witnessed. She had thrown a bucket of cleaning powder at a ghost and it had worked. The equation was simple: yet it broke every foundation of her world, so what now? Tuan demanded, pacing the small room like a caged animal. We just sit here and wait. Wait for another puddle to turn into a monster. We stay away from reflections. We stay together. And we follow the other rules, Min said, his gaze hard. We survive until sunrise. Survive? Tuan scoffed, the sound harsh and brittle. His fear was beginning to curdle into anger. It was a more manageable emotion, a shield against the gibbering helplessness that threatened to consume him. This is not survival. This is a cage. We are trapped in a box with things that shouldn't exist, following rules written in blood on a pirate map. This pirate map is all that is keeping us alive. Min shot back, his own composure cracking. Emma watched them, her mind a frantic mess. The vision of her drowning felt like a permanent tattoo on her brain. The skeletal face of the Mada was imprinted there. The rules, which she had dismissed as rural superstition hours ago, now held the absolute power of divine law. Her grandmother, what did she have to do with all this? A consultant for the dead. Min's words echoed. She helped the spirits rest easy. Was this what she dealt with? Did she walk these halls, armed with salt and ancient knowledge, a warden in a prison of horrors? The thought was so outlandish, so contrary to the gentle woman who taught her how to make bon chung and told her stories of clever mice and foolish tigers, that Emma felt a fresh wave of disorientation. There are logs, she said suddenly, her voice raspy. Intake logs. Records. My grandmother's associate, the man in Unit 7. I need to know his name. I need to know why they were here. Min hesitated, then gave a weary sigh. He gestured to a tall, metal filing cabinet. The records from the last month are in the top drawer. But what good will a name do you now, journalist? Information is all I have, Emma retorted, pulling open the drawer. The files were neat, organized by date. She found the intake form for the man from Unit 7. His name was Pham Van Kentucky. Cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, the same impossibly clean explanation given for her grandmother. His employer was listed as the Ton Hoa Cultural Preservation Society, a front, Emma suspected. His emergency contact was Banagwai, and what about the others? Tuan said, leaning over a gurney that had been rolled into the hallway just outside the office. A sheet covered another still form. He was looking for a distraction, anything to do besides sit and wait for the fear to build. Who are all these poor souls trapped in here with us? Leave them be, Tuan, Min warned, his voice tight with anxiety. We do not disturb the dead. But Tuan was already at the foot of the gurney, his hand reaching for the paper toe tag tied to the body's ankle. He was a man drowning, and he was thrashing at the water. His bravado, his sarcasm, it was all a desperate attempt to feel in control, to prove that he was not afraid, that he was bigger than the rules. I'm just curious, he sneered, though his hand trembled slightly. He lifted the tag. The clock on the wall read 12:48 a.m. Tuan, no. Emma shouted, a jolt of pure ice shooting through her veins. Min lunged forward. Don't say it. Rule number 2. But it was too late. Tuan, in a final, fatalistic act of defiance, read the name aloud, spitting it into the silent, watchful air of the morgue. What's the worst that can happen? He mocked. Let's see. This one's name is Tran Quang Hai. He dropped the tag. The name hung in the air, an invisible, terrible thing. For a moment, there was nothing. Absolute silence, broken only by the drumming of the rain against the windows. Tuan let out a short, sharp laugh, though it sounded more like a sob. See? Nothing. Just stories. Just, crack, the sound was sharp, definitive. Like a thick branch snapping under pressure. It came from the gurney. From under the sheet, everyone froze. Crack. Snap. Slowly, with a series of distinct, sickening pops and cracks, the body beneath the sheet began to move. It wasn't the fluid movement of life. It was stiff, jerky, the sound of joints long seized by rigor mortis being forced to articulate. The sheet rose as the corpse sat bolt upright. Its movements were puppet-like, rigid. The head swiveled on the neck with a grinding sound, turning towards them. The eyes snapped open. They were not the dull, milky eyes of the dead. They were blazing with a cold, pale green light, like phosphorescence on a rotting log. That it was him. Tran Quang Hai. And he had heard his name. The creature, the Quang Ti, swung its legs off the gurney. They hit the floor with a heavy, solid thud. It stood, its back ramrod straight, its arms held stiffly at its sides. It took a step. Then another. Not a walk, but a series of short, powerful hops, its stiff legs moving in perfect unison. Each landing jarred the floor. Thud. 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 That it fixed its glowing eyes on Tuan. It let out a low, guttural hiss, a sound from a chest with no air. It had found the one who had called it, and then it leaped. Chapter 5, Chaos erupted. The Quang Ti cleared the 5 feet between the gurney and Tuan in a single, impossibly fast hop, its stiff arms outstretched, fingers curled into rigid claws. Tuan screamed, a raw, animal sound of terror, and threw himself backward, crashing into a metal instrument tray. Scalpels and forceps clattered across the floor, upstairs. Min yelled, shoving Lin, who was paralyzed with fear, towards the main staircase at the end of the hall. Now. Emma didn't hesitate. The logic of the supernatural was now the only logic that mattered. They ran, their feet pounding on the linoleum. Behind them, the rhythmic, heavy thud, thud, thud of the hopping corpse was a terrifying drumbeat of pursuit. It was faster than it had any right to be, its powerful, stiff-legged jumps covering ground with relentless efficiency. They scrambled up the main staircase, the worn wooden steps groaning under their frantic weight. The second floor was even darker and more dilapidated than the first. It was a maze of short corridors and closed doors, smelling of dust and mildew. Storage rooms, from the looks of it, in here. Emma shouted, throwing open a random door and shoving the others inside. It was a small linen closet. Tuan and Min slammed the heavy wooden door shut and threw their weight against it just as the Quang Ti crashed into the other side. Boom, the entire door frame shuddered. The wood splintered. Boom. A crack appeared down the center of the door. The creature's strength was unnatural, inhuman. It won't hold. Tuan yelled, his face white with terror, his earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by the stark realization of his own foolishness. I'm sorry. Troy Oi, I'm so sorry. Apologies won't stop it. Min grunted, straining against the door. We need to think. Boom. Crack. A rigid, gray hand punched through the splintered wood, fingers grasping blindly. Lin shrieked and scrambled to the back of the closet, their flashlights danced wildly around the small space. It was filled with shelves of yellowed sheets, brittle blankets, and old medical supplies. In the corner, Emma's light caught something. Another door. Small, set low in the wall. A maintenance hatch. There, she yelled. Help me. While Min and Tuan held the main door against the relentless assault, Emma pulled at the small hatch. It was stuck fast with rust and age. She kicked at it, her boot connecting with a loud clang. It budged. She kicked it again, and the lock gave way with a screech of tortured metal. It opened into darkness. A narrow, dusty crawlspace. Go. Go now. Min shouted as the main door began to cave inward. Lin scrambled through the opening first, then Emma. Tuan dove through headfirst just as the closet door burst open, ripped from its hinges. Min was the last one through, pulling the small hatch closed behind them as the glowing green eyes of the Quang Ti peered into the ruined closet. They were in a tight, suffocating space, a network of crawlspaces between the walls. The air was thick with ancient dust that clogged their throats and made their eyes water. They crawled on hands and knees, following the narrow passage, the thudding of the Quang Ti now muffled but still terrifyingly present as it began to search for them on the other side of the wall. "Where does this go?" Lin whispered, her voice trembling in the dark. "I don't know," Min panted. "These passages connect the old building's infrastructure. Just keep moving." They crawled in terrified silence, the only sounds their own ragged breaths and the scraping of their clothes on the rough wooden planks. The thudding faded as they moved deeper into the building's hidden skeleton. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the passage opened up. They tumbled out, one by one, into a room that it was an office. But it was unlike the functional, grimy office downstairs. This one was preserved. A thick layer of dust covered everything, but the room itself was a time capsule. A heavy mahogany desk stood against one wall, a leather-bound chair behind it. On the desk sat a dried-up inkwell and a fountain pen. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound tomes. The air was still and dead. This room had been sealed for a very long time. "What is this place?" Tuan whispered, wiping cobwebs from his face. Emma ran her hand over the desk, disturbing the dust of decades. Her fingers brushed against a brass nameplate. She blew on it, and the engraved letters appeared. Dr. Jean-Pierre Dubois. "Directeur, it's the original director's office," she breathed. "The French director." Min shone his flashlight on the walls. They weren't just lined with books. There were framed anatomical charts, displaying the musculature and skeletal structure of the human body. But next to them were other drawings, unframed, pinned directly to the wall. They were frantic, obsessive sketches done in charcoal and ink. Emma stepped closer, her blood running cold. One of the drawings depicted a skeletal, waterlogged figure emerging from a river. Underneath it, Dubois had scrawled, "Le fantôme de la rivière. Mada." Another showed a stiff, upright corpse with a paper talisman on its forehead. "Le cadavre sauteur. Quang Ti." There were others. A grotesque fusion of multiple bodies, crawling on a ceiling, labeled "Les Pacides." Qui Nap Trang. A shadowy, indistinct figure with piercing eyes, "Le Demon de l'Ombre. Ma Qui." He knew, Emma whispered, a horrifying understanding dawning. He wasn't just running a morgue. He was studying them. Min found a large, leather-bound journal on the desk. He carefully opened it. The pages were filled with elegant, sloping French script, the ink faded but still legible. "Can anyone read this?" he asked. Emma had taken 4 years of high school French. It was rusty, but the urgency of the situation sharpened her focus. She leaned over the book, her flashlight beam illuminating the page. Lin, her curiosity momentarily overriding her fear, joined her, her own academic French better than Emma's. The early entries were clinical. Dr. Dubois wrote of the challenges of establishing a modern medical facility in colonial Indochina. He complained about the humidity, the local superstitions, the difficulty of his work. But then, the tone began to shift. October 12, 1938, Emma translated haltingly. "The locals speak of the ground this building stands on. They say it is cursed, a place of bad death. They bring offerings. Foolishness. Yet, the bodies here do not rest easy. There is an energy. A potency I have not encountered before." They flipped forward. The writing grew more erratic, more obsessive. March 4, 1939. "I have witnessed it myself. A corpse, improperly handled, moved. It sat up. The porters were terrified. They spoke of a hopping corpse. I am a man of science, but what I saw defies rational explanation. This is not biology. This is something else. A form of necrotic energy. A key, perhaps. A key to reversing the process of death itself. Immortality, Lynn whispered, her face pale in the glow of the flashlights. He was trying to achieve immortality. They kept reading, a frantic search for answers. Du Bois described his experiments, crude attempts to reanimate tissue using galvanic batteries combined with local rituals he had observed. He wrote of his failures, the grotesque results, the entities he accidentally summoned and barely contained. He wasn't a scientist, he was a necromancer in a lab coat. Then Emma saw it. A name she recognized. An entry filled with rage and frustration, November 21st, 1940. My work is being thwarted. There is a local woman, a so-called Mijia or wise woman, who comes to the grounds at night. She leaves charms, speaks prayers. She strengthens the seals that I am trying to break. She is a weaver, but her true craft is in binding spirits, not thread. The locals revere her as a Denjumo, a spirit warden. Her interference is intolerable. I must find a way to remove her. Her name is Lone Teen Gwyn. Emma felt the air leave her lungs. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. Banagwai, her grandmother. Not a victim of the morgue, but its protector. Not a consultant, but a warrior fighting a secret, decades-long war against the evil this place contained. The incident of her death suddenly looked very different. It wasn't an accident. It was the final battle in a long campaign. Crash, the sound of splintering wood from the crawlspace entrance shattered the revelation. A gray, rigid hand burst through the small hatch. The Kwang Ti had found them. Chapter 6, the hunt was on again. They fled the director's hidden office, pouring out into another dusty, disused corridor as the Kwang Ti ripped the hatch from its frame and hopped into the room behind them. It paused for a moment amidst Du Bois's dusty research, its glowing green eyes scanning, before fixing on them and renewing its relentless pursuit. Thud. 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 The sound was the heartbeat of their nightmare. We can't outrun it forever. Tuan yelled, his voice cracking with exertion and fear. Du Bois's notes. Emma shouted, her mind racing. Did he write about a weakness? Salt. Or rice? Min gasped, remembering the old legends. Purity. It hates purity. It's an abomination. Where are we going to find salt and rice in a morgue at 1 a.m? Tuan shot back despairingly. They rounded a corner and saw a heavy metal door, slightly ajar. It led to a steep, narrow service stairwell, the kind used by janitors. Without a second thought, they plunged down the stairs, their descent a chaotic clatter of footsteps on grated metal. The Kwang Ti followed, its hops on the metal stairs creating a deafening, discordant clang. 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 Clang, the stairs emptied out onto the ground floor, but in an unfamiliar section of the building. It seemed to be a utility and supply area. Pipes snaked along the ceiling, and the walls were lined with industrial shelving, spread out. Look for anything. Min commanded. They split up, frantically searching the shelves with their flashlights. They found boxes of sterile gloves, jugs of disinfectant, stacks of body bags, nothing useful. The clanging on the stairs grew louder, closer. It was almost upon them. Then Lynn cried out. Here. She was pointing her light at the bottom shelf in a dark corner. On it were several thick, 50-pound bags of something. Stenciled on the side of the bags in faded red lettering were the words, MUIA with acute, rock salt. It was used during the rare cold snaps to de-ice the morgue's entrance path. Yes. Min cried, a spark of hope in his eyes. He and Tuan each grabbed a corner of one of the heavy bags. The Kwang Ti landed with a final, deafening clang at the bottom of the stairs, not 10 yards away. It turned its head in that stiff, unnatural way and fixed its glowing gaze upon them. Now. Min yelled, with a shared grunt of effort. They ripped the bag open. A cascade of coarse, crystalline salt poured onto the floor, creating a thick, white line between them and the creature. The Quang Ti hopped forward, its dead eyes locked on Tuan, the one who had defiled its rest. Its stiff feet landed on the line of salt. The reaction was violent and immediate. A horrifying, high-pitched hiss, like 1,000 cicadas screaming at once, erupted from the creature. Black, smoky vapor poured from its feet where they touched the salt, as if its very essence were being burned away. It recoiled, hopping backward, its body convulsing. The salt was like acid to its unholy form. That it was working. It was actually working, but the creature was not stupid. It stared at the line of salt, then at the clear floor on either side. It crouched, its stiff legs bending with a series of sharp cracks. It's going to jump over it. Emma realized that it leaped, a powerful spring that would easily carry it over their flimsy barrier. But as it sailed through the air, Lin, her mind now sharp with a strange, adrenaline-fueled clarity, acted again. She had grabbed a metal dustpan and, in the split second the creature was airborne, she scooped up a panful of the rock salt and hurled it. The salt sprayed across the Quang Ti's chest and face mid-flight. That it shrieked, a sound of pure agony, its trajectory thrown off. It crashed to the ground on their side of the barrier, writhing and smoking, its body spasming as the salt burned it. Don't let it get up. Min roared. He and Tuan grabbed the ripped bag and, with a final, desperate heave, emptied the remaining 40 pounds of rock salt directly onto the thrashing corpse. The hissing intensified, the cloud of black smoke thickening until it almost obscured the creature from view. Its movements became weaker, more sporadic. It was stunned, neutralized, but Emma had the terrifying feeling that it wasn't destroyed. The freezer, she yelled, pointing to a large, walk-in refrigerated locker at the end of the utility corridor. The kind used for overflow storage. Get it in there. There was no time to question. Adrenaline and terror propelled them. Min and Tuan each grabbed one of the creature's stiff, smoking arms, their hands recoiling from the unnatural cold of its skin. The Quang Ti was heavy, a dead weight of pure malice, but they dragged it across the floor, leaving a trail of salt and black scorch marks. Emma wrenched the heavy freezer door open, a blast of frigid air washing over them. Lin held it open as the two men swung the neutralized corpse inside. It landed on the grated floor with a final, heavy thud. Emma slammed the insulated door shut and threw the heavy locking bolt into place with a resounding clank. For a moment, they all stood there, panting, chests heaving, listening. Thump. A muffled sound from within the freezer. Thump, thump. It was trying to get up. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was weaker now, slower. The combination of the purifying salt and the intense, paralyzing cold was working. The thumping grew more and more infrequent, until finally, it stopped. Silence. They had done it. They had survived a second monster. Tuan slid down the wall, his head in his hands. I'm so stupid, he mumbled, his voice thick with shame. So stupid. We're all alive, Min said, though his voice shook. That is what matters. Emma leaned against the cold metal of the freezer door, her mind a maelstrom. Her grandmother. The director. The rules. It was all connected. This wasn't just a haunted house, it was a battlefield. A prison. And her grandmother had been the warden. She looked at the others, Min, the weary guardian of the rules, Lin, the terrified student who had become their unlikely savior twice over, Tuan, the broken skeptic. They weren't just a journalist, a morgue worker, a student, and a taxi driver anymore. They were survivors. They were soldiers in a war they hadn't known existed. The clock on the wall of the utility corridor showed that it was 1:07 a.m. A new kind of dread, cold and quiet, began to settle in Emma's gut. She looked at Min, and she saw the same fear reflected in his eyes. They had won the battle, but in the frantic chase, in the chaos of their flight, no one had been paying attention to the doors they had left open behind them. And the clock had just passed 1. Chapter 7. The silence that followed the cessation of the Quang Ti's desperate thumping was somehow more terrifying than the noise itself. It was a dead silence, profound and absolute, leaving the four survivors alone with the frantic hammering of their own hearts. They stood in the utility corridor, a strange tableau of terror and relief, their faces pale in the harsh glare of their flashlights. The air was cold, smelling of salt and the ozone-like scorch of vanquished necrotic energy. Tuan was still on the floor, his back against the wall, rocking slightly. He was a man hollowed out. His defiant act had summoned a demon, and the price had been the last of his bravado. Lin, by contrast, seemed to have found a strange, brittle calm. Her 2 acts of life-saving desperation had forged something hard in her core, though her eyes remained wide, reflecting the ambient horror like dark pools. Min, ever the weary sentinel, was already thinking ahead, his gaze sweeping the corridor. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "This area is too open." Emma nodded, her mind a razor-sharp crystal of fear and focus. The discovery in the director's office had changed everything. This wasn't random chaos. It was a system, a dark ecosystem with rules, predators, and a history. Her grandmother hadn't been a victim, she was a combatant. And now, so was Emma. Back to the director's office, she decided. It's hidden. Defensible. We can barricade the crawlspace entrance. The plan was simple, born of desperation. They had to move through the morgue, a building they now knew was actively hostile, and lock every door they passed. The clock was their enemy. It was past 1 a.m. A new rule was in play, a new horror lying in wait. They moved as a unit, a tight, nervous formation. Min took the lead, his knowledge of the morgue's layout their only reliable map. Tuan, coaxed to his feet, took the rear, his head on a constant, terrified swivel. Emma and Lin were in the middle, their flashlights cutting trembling paths through the oppressive darkness. The main corridors of the ground floor were eerily quiet. Too quiet. Every shadow seemed to stretch, every drip of water from the storm-battered roof sounded like a footstep. They worked with grim efficiency, pushing heavy oak doors shut, turning old skeleton keys and rusted locks, sliding heavy bolts into place. Each metallic clank was a small victory against the encroaching dread. They were securing a hallway leading to the west wing when it happened. From a room at the far end of the corridor, a loud crash echoed, the sound of metal trays and glass shattering on a tile floor. Every one of them froze, their blood turning to ice. What was that? Lin whispered, her newfound calm shattering instantly. It could be anything, Min said, though his voice lacked conviction. The storm, a rat, but they knew better. In this place, after midnight, there were no coincidences. There was only the house and its occupants. From the room, a low moan drifted down the hall. It was a sound of pain, human and pitiful. It sounded like a woman crying for help. Lin's medical instincts, buried under layers of terror, resurfaced. "Someone's hurt," she gasped. "There's someone else alive in here." "No," Min said, grabbing her arm as she took a step forward. "Don't. It's a trick." But the moaning grew louder, more desperate. "Que toi voix. Help me, please, it hurts." The voice was bait, and Lin, her nerves frayed to the breaking point, took it. A sob of pure panic escaped her lips. The combination of the crash and the pleading voice was too much. Her mind snapped. She tore her arm from Min's grasp and bolted. "Lin." Emma screamed. She didn't run towards the sound. She ran away from it, back the way they had come, a blind, animal flight. She sprinted down the long hallway, her footsteps echoing wildly. At the end of the hall was a heavy, iron-fired door they had left open, planning to secure it on their way back. Lin shoved through it without breaking stride and disappeared into the adjoining corridor. She didn't look back. She didn't stop to close it, to lock it, to secure it, the heavy iron door swung slowly on its hinges, its groan echoing in the sudden silence. It didn't close. It remained open. An invitation, the rule, Emma thought with a sickening lurch in her stomach. Keep all doors locked after 1 a.m. The moaning from the room down the hall stopped. A profound silence fell, a watchful, waiting stillness. Min let out a low, guttural curse. She left it open. He looked at the clock on his wrist. 1:13 a.m. He stared at the open doorway as if it were the gaping mouth of hell itself. The invitation has been sent. Chapter 8. They found Lynn huddled in a small alcove 2 corridors away from the open fire door, sobbing into her hands. The adrenaline from her flight had vanished, leaving her in the grips of a profound, shaking shame. "I'm sorry," she wept as they approached. "I panicked. I heard it. I just ran." "It's okay," Emma said, trying to soothe her, though her own heart was hammering against her ribs. "We're all on edge." But it wasn't okay. The air in the morgue had changed. The oppressive silence had been replaced by a low, almost subliminal hum, a feeling of immense energy gathering. And from the distant, unexplored corners of the building, a new sound began to surface. It was a wet, sticky, tearing sound. The sound of things being reshaped. "We have to go back," Min said, his face grim. "We have to close that door." It was a death sentence, and they all knew it. To walk back towards that open invitation was madness. But to leave it open was to let the poison spread. As they debated, a morgue drawer down the hall slid open with a loud, metallic screech. Then another. And another. All down the corridor, the stainless steel doors of the refrigerated body storage units were opening on their own. They turned their flashlights towards the nearest open unit. The body inside, covered by a sheet, began to twitch. But this was different from the Quang Ti. It wasn't a stiff, reanimating corpse. It was fluid. The sheet clung to the form beneath as it writhed, its limbs seeming to elongate, to stretch like taffy. From the unit next to it, another shrouded body was doing the same. It slid off its gurney onto the floor with a wet smack. With a series of sickening cracks, its limbs began to bend at impossible angles. It crawled from its unit, its head swiveling 360 degrees to look at them. The first corpse began to ooze off its slab, a semi-liquid mass of flesh and bone. The two creatures crawled toward each other, drawn by some unspeakable magnetism. They met in the middle of the corridor, and the true horror began. Flesh melted into flesh. The sheets dissolved into the fusion. Limbs tangled, broke, and reformed. Bone snapped and fused with bone. It was a grotesque act of biological alchemy, guided by a malevolent, unseen artist. In seconds, the two bodies had merged, creating a new, singular entity. It was a spider-like horror, a bulbous, double-torso monstrosity propped up on a chaotic tangle of 8 arms and legs. It clung to the floor, its many joints bending in every direction, before it scuttled with terrifying speed up the wall and onto the ceiling, where it clung, dripping, its many heads twisting to stare down at them. A Kui Nap Trang. Lin let out a choked, strangled sound. Tuan, his face a mask of disbelief, could only whisper, What is that?" "Spirits that possess the dead," Min breathed, his voice trembling. "They make new things." As if on cue, more sounds echoed from every corner of the morgue. Sliding drawers, wet tearing, the snapping of bone. The uninvited guests were waking up and beginning to play with their toys. The morgue was no longer a prison. It was a workshop. The spider thing on the ceiling let out a series of sharp, chittering clicks and began to crawl towards them. "Move!" Emma screamed, pulling them back. They ran, but their flight was immediately cut short. The hallway in front of them, which moments ago had stretched 100 feet, now ended in a solid brick wall. It was seamless, covered in the same peeling yellow paint as the rest of the building. It hadn't been there a minute ago. No, no, that's not possible, Tuan stammered, touching the wall as if to confirm its reality. The morgue, Min gasped, his eyes wide with a new layer of terror. It's changing. It's trapping us with them. They turned to run the other way, but the corridor behind them was also gone, replaced by a long, dark hallway they didn't recognize, lined with closed doors on both sides. The layout was shifting, the architecture of the building becoming as fluid and nightmarish as the bodies themselves. They were mice in a maze that was actively rearranging itself to ensure they never found the exit. The chittering of the amalgamation on the ceiling grew louder. It was closing in. They had no choice. They ducked into the new, unfamiliar hallway, picking a door at random and throwing themselves inside, bolting it behind them. They found themselves in what looked like a disused ward, filled with rows of empty, rusting bed frames. It was a dead end. From the other side of the door, they could hear the spider horror crawling past, its chittering clicks fading down the impossible hallway. They were safe, for a moment. But they were utterly, completely lost. We'll never get out, Lynn sobbed, sinking to the floor. The whole building is alive. Emma's mind was racing. If the building was a maze, there had to be a center. If it was a prison, there had to be a warden's office. Du Bois's room, she said. Somehow, we have to get back to Du Bois's office. It felt stable. It felt separate from the rest of this place. It was their only hope. They waited until the sounds outside faded, then cautiously opened the door. The hallway had changed again. It was now a perfect crossroads, stretching in 4 identical, dimly lit directions. They picked one at random and began to navigate the shifting nightmare, stalked by the sounds of the grotesque things that now crawled the halls of Ton Ho Morgue. They caught glimpses of them, a centipede-like creature made of a dozen legs and a single, elongated torso slithering into a ventilation duct, a silent, bloated thing that walked on its hands, its head lolling obscenely between its shoulders. They didn't engage. They just ran, trying doors, retreating from dead ends, their sanity fraying with every impossible twist of the architecture. After what felt like hours of this disorienting hell, they stumbled into a familiar corridor. It was the one that housed the crawlspace entrance to the director's hidden office. With a collective sigh of relief, they scrambled through the hatch and sealed it behind them, finally safe from the shifting labyrinth and its monstrous inhabitants. The office was just as they had left it, still, silent, and thick with the dust of ages. It felt like the eye of a hurricane. We need more answers, Emma said, her voice grim. She went straight to Du Bois's desk, her hands searching every surface. If he created this mess, he must have known more. There has to be something else. Her fingers found a small, almost invisible seam in the side of the desk's central pedestal. She pushed, and a wooden panel clicked open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside were 2 items. One was another journal, thinner than the first, its leather cover black and unmarked. The other was a set of rolled-up architectural drawings of the morgue. But they were covered in strange, spidery red ink, charting lines of energy, points of convergence, and frantic notations. Min unrolled the drawings. These aren't construction plans, he said. They're maps. Of the curse. Emma opened the black journal. The handwriting was the same, but it was a frantic, barely legible scrawl, the words of a man on the edge of utter madness. It is not a curse, she translated, the French words tumbling out in a horrified whisper. It is a wound. I did not understand. This ground, it is not merely haunted. It is a site of desecration. A village, wiped out by plague in the last century. Their bodies were not buried with rites. They were thrown into a pit and burned. A place of immense pain, a vortex of tormented spirits. The final entries were horrifyingly clear. My experiments did not just fail. They succeeded in the worst possible way. I sought a door to immortality, and I found one. But it was the wrong door. I have torn a hole in the veil, a permanent gateway to the realm of the unavenged dead. This building is no longer a morgue. It is a prison, and I was its first, foolish warden. But the true power here, it is contained. Sealed by the old woman and her primitive magic, as Emma read those words, Tuan, who had been searching the compartment, made a discovery of his own. Tucked deep in the back, behind the black journal, was another object. It was small, wrapped in faded indigo cloth tied with a simple cord. He handed it to Emma. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it. It was another journal. Smaller, its cover made of soft, worn leather. The script inside was not French. It was beautiful, precise Vietnamese. It was her grandmother's. Ba Nguai must have found this secret compartment and used it as a hiding place for her own research, a silent subversion of the director's mad ambitions. She opened it to the first page. My name is Lone Teen Nguyen, she read, her own grandmother's voice seeming to whisper in her ear. And this is my burden. The Frenchman opened a wound, and I have spent my life trying to keep it from consuming the world of the living. The spirits here are not all evil. They are in pain. But their pain is a weapon that can kill. The rules are not for us. They are for them. They are protocols to keep the prison quiet, to keep the inmates from tearing each other, and the walls of their cells, apart. Emma flipped through the pages, her heart aching. There were detailed entries on each type of entity, their triggers, their nature. And then she found it. A chapter titled, Soi Chi Du, The Seals of Binding. The greatest horrors, Ba Nguai had written, the ones with true consciousness and malice, cannot be allowed to wake. The director almost freed the oldest one. I was able to bind them, but the binding is fragile. I have woven my own life force, my own spirit, into sacred red threads. These threads are not charms. They are locks. Each one is tied to an anchor, a specific corpse whose own spiritual resonance is strong enough to hold the lock in place. To break a thread is to unlock a cell. And one cell, in particular, must never, ever be opened. A map, drawn in her grandmother's elegant hand, was folded into the page. It showed the layout of the morgue's main cold storage. Several units were circled in red. Unit 4, was marked with a large, emphatic X and a single, chilling word, shadow. A new, terrible understanding settled over Emma. She now held the keys to the kingdom, both the director's mad science and her grandmother's sacred duty. She looked at the faces of her fellow survivors, illuminated by the flickering beams of their flashlights in the dusty, secret room. The Quy Nap Trang were still crawling through the shifting halls outside, but the greatest threat, she now realized, wasn't crawling the halls. It was sleeping. It was locked away, bound by a simple piece of red thread. And she knew exactly where to find it. Chapter 9, the director's hidden office had transformed from a sanctuary into a pressure cooker. Outside its dusty, sealed walls, the morgue was a symphony of hellish noise, the wet, scuttling sounds of the Quy Nap Trang, the groaning of the shifting architecture, the distant, echoing shatter of glass. Inside, the silence was just as loud, thick with the weight of their new, terrible knowledge. Emma sat on the floor, her grandmother's journal open in her lap, its cloth cover feeling both like a sacred relic and a heavy burden. The flashlight beam illuminated the elegant Vietnamese script, words of duty and sorrow that spanned decades. She was no longer just a journalist investigating a death, she was an heir to a secret war, holding its final, desperate testament. She looked up at the others, her face grim. My grandmother wasn't a consultant, she began, her voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos in her mind. She was the warden. This whole place, it's a prison. Du Bois didn't just summon a few ghosts. He tore a hole in reality, and these things have been crawling through ever since. She explained what she had read, her voice weaving a narrative of French hubris and Vietnamese sacrifice. She told them about the desecrated burial ground, the wound in the world, and her grandmother's lifelong struggle to keep it contained. Min listened, his face a stony mask of vindicated dread. He had lived with the symptoms for years, and now he was hearing the diagnosis. Lin trembled, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to make herself smaller, as if she could shrink away from the sheer scale of the horror. Tuan, however, listened with a new, dangerous intensity. The shame from his earlier foolishness had been baked away by terror, leaving behind a core of hardened resolve. So the rules, Min clarified, they are to keep the prison stable. To keep the inmates quiet. Exactly, Emma confirmed. And the red threads, they aren't just charms. They're the locks on the cells of the most powerful prisoners. That was when the idea, insidious and desperate, took root in her mind. She looked at the director's esoteric maps, then back at her grandmother's journal. Two different approaches to the same problem. One sought to control, the other to contain. But both agreed on one thing: the prison ran on a complex network of supernatural energy. What if we don't just follow the rules? Emma proposed, the words tasting like heresy on her tongue. What if we break the system itself? Min stared at her, his eyes narrowing. What are you saying? Look, she said, pointing to a diagram in her grandmother's journal. It showed a web of energy lines, all converging on a few key points, the anchor corpses. This whole place is a machine. A broken, horrifying machine, but a machine nonetheless. My grandmother's threads are what hold it together. What if we cut one? Not just any one. The keystone. She flipped to another page, showing a drawing of a complex, 7-looped knot. Quan Tone, Banagwai had labeled it. The safety lock. This seal regulates the energy flow for the entire lower level. It is the linchpin. To remove it would be unpredictable. Unpredictable how? Lin whispered, her voice barely audible. Maybe it causes a cascade failure, Emma argued, the desperate logic taking shape. A supernatural power surge that shorts everything out. Maybe it disrupts the energy field long enough for the building to stop shifting, for the Queen Nap Trang to be stunned. Long enough for us to get out. Min stood up, his face thunderous. Are you insane? He seethed, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Have you learned nothing? We have broken 3 rules by accident and mistake. Each time, a new hell is unleashed. And you want to break the most sacred rule of all, on purpose? The rule my partner Bao died ignoring. You are talking about suicide. I'm talking about fighting back. Tuan interjected, getting to his feet and standing with Emma. His voice was firm, his fatalism now a weapon. What's your plan, Min? Sit here and wait for those things to find a way in. Pray the sun comes up before we're all dead or insane. I broke a rule. I brought that, Quang Ti, on us. I won't make that mistake again. But sitting here, doing nothing, that feels like a bigger mistake right now. A deep, painful schism fractured the group. It was caution versus desperation, containment versus action. She is speaking with the same arrogance as the Frenchman. Min accused, jabbing a finger towards Emma. Trying to control what she doesn't understand. This is how this all started. My grandmother understood it. Emma shot back, her voice rising. And I'm trying to use her knowledge to end it. Your way just gets us killed slower. Lin, caught in the crossfire, began to cry silently, shaking her head. Please, don't fight. Don't, we have to stick together. But the line had been drawn. Min and Lin were frozen by fear and a deep-seated respect for the rules. Emma and Tuan were propelled by guilt and the slimmest, most reckless glimmer of hope. We're doing it, Tuan said, his voice flat and final. He looked at Emma. What's the plan? The plan was as desperate as the idea itself. The Tone was on a corpse in Cold Storage Unit 12, in the main ground floor storage area. According to another of Bunagwai's notes, the Nap Trang were drawn to loud, rhythmic sounds, their shattered consciousnesses mistaking it for a heartbeat. They found their diversion in a disused maintenance closet, a heavy wrench and a metal pipe suspended by a cord over a steel drum. By tying another cord to the wrench and running it under the door, they could pull it from the hallway, creating a repeating, clanging drumbeat that would hopefully draw the creatures away from the cold storage wing. Min refused to participate. He and a terrified Lin barricaded themselves inside the director's office, the silence between them and the others colder than any morgue slab. "You are opening a door you will not be able to close," was the last thing Min said to Emma, his voice heavy with prophetic doom. Emma and Tuan crept through the shifting, impossible corridors, their hearts pounding in time with the distant, rhythmic clang, clang, clang of their diversion. It seemed to be working. The wet scuttling and chittering sounds were drawn towards the noise, allowing them to slip past unnoticed. Twice, they saw the grotesque amalgamations crawl past the end of a corridor, and they flattened themselves into alcoves, holding their breath until the horrors were gone. Finally, they reached the main cold storage area. It was deathly quiet here, the air frigid and still. They found Unit 12. Emma's hand trembled as she reached for the handle. This was it. The point of no return. Tuan put a hand on her shoulder. "We're in this together," he said, his voice a low reassurance. "Whatever happens." She nodded, took a deep breath, and pulled the door open. The corpse inside was ancient, its skin like yellowed parchment stretched over a skeletal frame. But stitched onto its chest, directly over the heart, was the red thread. It was beautiful and impossibly complex, a seven-looped knot of vibrant crimson that seemed to pulse with a faint, inner light. It was the only spot of color, of life, in the entire monochrome room. Emma pulled a scalpel from her pocket, its steel blade seeming like a profane violation in this sacred, terrible space. Her resolve wavered. Min's warning echoed in her ears. "You are opening a door you will not be able to close, Emma," Tuan whispered, his voice gentle. "It's the only way." She closed her eyes, whispered an apology to her grandmother, and with a swift, clean motion, sliced through the center of the crimson knot. The severed ends of the thread recoiled, not like simple string, but like living things, withering and turning black as if burned. And then, silence. Chapter 10. It wasn't a roar of energy or a catastrophic explosion. It was the opposite. It was a plunge into absolute, profound silence. The distant clang of their diversion ceased. The wet, crawling sounds of the Nap Trang vanished. The low, energetic hum of the building died, as if the morgue's heart had just stopped beating. A cold descended. It was not the sterile chill of refrigeration. It was a deep, penetrating, grave cold that seemed to leach the warmth directly from their bones. The air grew heavy, thick, and still. "Did it work?" Tuan whispered, his breath pluming in the sudden, intense frost. Emma didn't answer. She was staring at the far corner of the room. The shadows there were wrong. They were pooling, coalescing, gathering into a patch of darkness that was deeper than the absence of light. It was a three-dimensional void, a hole in the very fabric of the room. Slowly, the void detached from the corner. It rose, unfolding like black smoke, taking on a tall, slender, vaguely humanoid shape. It had no face, no features, just a smooth, shifting surface of pure darkness. It was the Ma Kui. The shadow. They hadn't just unlocked a cell. They had released the warden's ultimate prisoner. They had decapitated the prison's hierarchy and put the king of the inmates on the throne. With a movement that was too quick to follow, the shadow thing dissolved, vanishing back into the ambient darkness of the room. But it wasn't gone. They could feel it. A vast, ancient, and utterly malevolent consciousness was now awake. And it was aware of them. "We made a mistake," Emma breathed, the words catching in her throat. A terrible mistake. They fled the cold storage unit, slamming the door shut as if it would do any good. They ran back through the corridors, which were now still and fixed, the architecture no longer shifting. The silence was absolute, pressing in on them, more terrifying than the cacophony it had replaced. They found their way back to the director's office. The barricade was down. Min and Lin were huddled together in the center of the room, their faces ashen. "What did you do?" Min whispered, his voice trembling with fury and terror. "What have you unleashed?" "It's here," Lin whimpered. "It's everywhere." Before Emma could explain, a voice echoed from the crawlspace entrance. A familiar voice. "Min. Is that you? Thank God, I found you." Min froze. His blood drained from his face. He turned slowly toward the sound. Standing in the opening, silhouetted by the hallway light, was a figure in a morgue worker's tunic. It was Bao. His dead partner, Bao. Min choked out. "I've been so lost, Min," the apparition said, its voice filled with sorrow. It stepped into the room. "Why did you let me go down to the basement alone? You knew the rules. You let me die. This is your fault, Min. All of it. You were too weak." Min stumbled back, shaking his head, tears streaming down his face. "No, no, it's not real." "Of course it's real," Bao said, his face twisting from sorrow to accusation. "Your failure is real. And now these people will die, just like I did. Because of you." As Min was being tormented, the entity turned its attention to Lin. The air next to her shimmered, and two new figures coalesced from the shadows. A man and a woman, dressed in stern, traditional clothes. "Lin's parents." "Lin," her father said, his voice dripping with disappointment. "We sacrificed everything to send you to medical school. To be a scientist. And here you are, cowering in the dark, believing in ghost stories like an ignorant child. You are a disgrace to this family." "All that potential," her mother added, her voice a whipcrack of disapproval. "Wasted. You have failed us. You have failed yourself." Lin curled into a ball, her hands over her ears, trying to block out the voices that echoed her deepest insecurities. The Marquis was a master psychologist. It didn't need claws or teeth. It wielded regret and fear like scalpels, dissecting their minds with surgical precision. Emma saw flashes, her grandmother's face, etched with sorrow, her own drowned body, bloated and blue, but the visions were fleeting, as if the entity was focusing its main efforts elsewhere. And then it turned to Tuan. From the darkest corner of the office, a small, whimpering sound emerged. A little girl, no older than 6, with pigtails and a bright yellow dress, stepped out of the shadows. She was crying. Tuan's entire body went rigid. He whispered, his voice breaking. That it was his daughter, Baoi, the little girl cried, her face streaked with tears. "I'm scared, Daddy. There are monsters. I got lost. Please, help me." Tuan took a step forward, his face a mask of agony and love. My sweet girl, how are you here?" "Don't, Tuan!" Emma yelled, grabbing his arm. "It's not her. It's the shadow." But Tuan couldn't hear her. He only saw his daughter, his reason for living, lost and terrified in this house of horrors. He shook Emma's hand off. "I'm coming, Con Yu," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Daddy's here. I won't let anything hurt you." He followed the weeping apparition of his daughter out of the office and into the darkened hall. Emma, her heart seizing with dread, ran after him, Min and Lin too lost in their own torment to follow. "Tuan, wait." She followed him into a large, cavernous storage room, filled with towering, rusty industrial shelving units loaded with old equipment and boxes. The apparition of stood in the center of the room, pointing a trembling finger at one of the largest, most unstable-looking shelf units. "The monster is behind there, bah," she cried. "It's a bad one. It's going to get the lady." At that exact moment, Emma entered the room, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Tuan's head whipped around. To his eyes, twisted by the Morgue's illusion, he saw a hulking, multi-limbed Kui Nap Trang lurching out from behind the shelving unit, its many arms reaching for Emma. It was the ultimate test of his redemption. His face, illuminated by Emma's flashlight, was a portrait of pure, selfless terror. "Emma, look out," he screamed. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think. He acted. With a primal roar of a father protecting his own, he threw his entire body, all of his weight and strength and desperation, against the base of the massive, rusty shelving unit. He was trying to topple it, to crush the monster he saw, to save Emma, to finally do something right. Emma, there was no monster. There was only Tuan, his face a mask of heroic madness, heaving against the shelves. With a deep, groaning screech of tortured metal, the towering unit tipped. It swayed for a heart-stopping second before crashing down with a deafening, thunderous boom, a tidal wave of steel and heavy equipment. Tuan didn't even have time to scream. He was buried instantly. Silence returned to the room, broken only by the settling dust and the clatter of a few falling objects. Emma stood frozen, her flashlight beam fixed on the mountain of wreckage where Tuan had been standing moments before. Over the twisted metal, the apparition of his daughter, Mai, stood unharmed. Her crying had stopped. She looked at Emma, and a wide, lipless, shadowy grin spread across her face. Then, she dissolved into a wisp of black smoke and was gone. Tuan was dead. He had died a hero, protecting her from a monster that was never there. The Morgue hadn't laid a finger on him. It had made him kill himself. And it had made her watch. Chapter 11. The wreckage of the shelving unit was a tomb, and the silence it created was a shroud. Emma stood frozen in the storage room, the beam of her flashlight trembling on the twisted metal and crushed boxes that had, a moment ago, been Tuan. The phantom grin of his daughter's apparition was burned into her vision. The Morgue had orchestrated this. It had used Tuan's love, his decency, and his desperate need for redemption as a weapon to destroy him. A broken sob escaped her lips. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. This was her fault. Her plan. Her arrogant belief that she could outsmart the darkness. Min had been right. She had acted with the same hubris as Du Bois, and the price had been paid in Tuan's blood. She stumbled back out of the room, her legs unsteady. She found Min and Lin in the hallway, slowly emerging from their own private hells. Lin was on her feet, but she was no longer there. Her eyes were vacant, staring at nothing, her face a smooth, unresponsive mask. The psychological assault had been too much, her mind had simply shut down, retreating to a place where the monsters couldn't reach it. Min looked old, his face etched with a decade of grief for Bao, now freshly compounded by the loss of Tuan. "He's gone," Emma choked out. Min simply nodded, the terrible understanding already in his eyes. He looked at Lin's catatonic form. "We can't stay here. It will pick us off one by one." They needed a sanctuary. A fortress. A place with no shadows, no complex corridors for it to twist, no dark corners for it to hide in. A place of stark, simple, clinical reality. "The autopsy room," Emma said, her voice hollow. "The main light. It was the last rule. The only one left. Never turn off the morgue's main light." It wasn't just a rule, it was their final line of defense. The bright, humming fluorescent light was a ward. Getting there was a journey through a landscape of fear. The morgue was still, but it was a predator's stillness. The silence was watchful. They half-carried, half-dragged the unresponsive Lin between them, her feet scuffing on the floor. Every shadow seemed to pulse with a hidden intelligence. From darkened doorways, they heard whispers, Tuan's voice, calling for his daughter, Bao's voice, accusing Min of failure. The Marquis was hurting them, toying with them. They finally reached the double doors of the Fong Jai Fao. Emma pushed them open, and the light from within spilled out like holy water. It was a brilliant, sterile white light, emanating from a large, rectangular fixture in the center of the ceiling. It hummed with a steady, reassuring electrical drone. The room was just as it had been, cold, clean, with its stainless steel tables and tiled walls. It was the heart of the morgue, and their last bastion. They brought Lin inside and sat her in a corner. Min slid a heavy instrument cabinet in front of the doors, blocking them. They were sealed in. The effect was immediate. The whispering from the hallway faded. The oppressive, conscious silence was replaced by the steady hum of the light. Here, in this bubble of stark illumination, the shadows were small and sharp. The Marquis's power seemed lessened, but it was not gone. It was outside, waiting. Pacing. They saw it as a distortion in the frosted glass of the door's small windows, a deeper darkness passing back and forth. It began to scratch at the door, a sound like nails on a chalkboard that grated on their already shattered nerves. Min, his face grim, picked up Ngui's journal from where Emma had dropped it. He began to read, his voice a low murmur, searching for a final answer, a last resort. Emma simply sat on the cold tile floor, watching the flickering of the fluorescent light, her guilt a cold, hard knot in her stomach. The light was their savior. The light was everything. Hours passed. The scratching stopped. The silence returned, but they knew it was just regrouping. Then the assault began. It started with a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. Then the entire building began to shake. The instruments on the trays rattled. From the hallway came a furious, deafening banging, as if a giant were trying to beat the walls down. Emma scrambled to the door and peered through the small window. In the hall, a figure was coalescing from the shadows. It was tall and imperious, dressed in the phantom image of a colonial-era suit. It was the face from the portrait in the hidden office. Dr. Jean-Pierre Dubois. The Marquis had taken the form of the morgue's original sinner. This shadowy Dubois slammed its insubstantial fists against the walls, and the real walls shook in response. It was pouring all its energy into breaking their sanctuary. A crack appeared in the plaster above the door. Dust rained down. Then, with a deafening crash from somewhere deep within the building, followed by the shriek of tearing metal, the main light above them flickered violently. Once. Twice. The steady hum became a sporadic, sputtering buzz. The generator. Min breathed, looking up, his face pale with horror. It's damaging the generator. The lights flickered again, staying off for a full second this time. In that brief moment of darkness, the room was plunged into a terrifying, absolute black. And in that black, Emma saw the shadow of Dubois standing inside the room with them. When the light returned, it was gone. Their protection was failing. The light sputtered again, strobing violently, casting the room in a frantic, terrifying disco of light and shadow. In one of the flashes, Emma saw the entity, no longer as Dubois but as a pure, featureless pillar of shadow, lunging across the room towards the weakest among them. Towards Lin. It was in that moment that Min made his choice. His face was set with a terrible, sacrificial resolve. He had read enough of the journal to understand Emma. The circle, he yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. He pointed to a page in the journal describing a final, desperate ritual. Get the salt. Now. He grabbed a heavy, steel stool. The lights flickered, and the shadow was upon Lin, its tendrils reaching for her face. The light is its shield. Min roared over the noise. It uses our fear of the dark. But it cannot control the chaos of true darkness. And with a final, desperate cry, he swung the stool with all his might into the flickering fluorescent light fixture. There was a shower of sparks, a pop of exploding glass, and the room was plunged into a suffocating, silent, absolute black. The final rule had been broken. Chapter 12, the darkness was a physical presence. It was total, robbing them of sight, of direction, of reality itself. But the silence lasted only for a second. It was replaced by a whisper, and then another. And another. Until the air was filled with 1,000 whispering voices, a cacophony of disembodied souls erupting from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was the horde of Han-Ma, the countless, restless spirits of the morgue, unleashed from their dormancy by the breaking of the final ward. They whispered in Vietnamese and French, speaking of pain, of loss, of anger, of fear. They swirled through the darkness, their phantom presence a cold brush against the skin. Toi, help me, so cold, he left me, pourquoi, the sensory assault was overwhelming. Emma clamped her hands over her ears, but the whispers were inside her head, mingling with her own panic. Through the chaos, she heard Min's voice, chanting, his words a steady, powerful anchor in the storm of whispers. Hoi kak vong han on quat, he lui buc. Retreat, you tormented souls. She remembered his command. The circle. She fumbled for the bag of rock salt, her hands shaking. She could hear Min's ragged breathing, the scrape of his shoes on the tile as he began to pace out a circle in the impenetrable dark. She heard a sharp hiss of breath and knew he had used the scalpel, that his own blood was now being added to the salt, just as the journal instructed Emma. Lin. In the center, he commanded. Emma crawled on the floor, her hands searching, until she found Lin's trembling, unresponsive form. She pulled her, dragging her into the area where she thought Min was working. The whispers grew louder, more aggressive. Cold spots moved around the room like pockets of liquid nitrogen. She could feel the Maquis' presence too, a vast, hateful intelligence, momentarily disoriented by the sheer chaos of the unleashed Han-Ma, but now focusing its rage on them. A faint, silvery light began to glow on the floor. It was the circle. The line of salt and blood was activating, a sacred boundary in the heart of the profane darkness. It provided the only light in the entire universe. Min was on the other side of the room, completing the final arc of the circle. Almost there, he yelled that he shoved Emma and Lin fully inside the glowing boundary. They stumbled into the center. The moment they were inside, the whispers receded, their cacophony blocked by the glowing ward. The sense of being watched, of being hunted by the Maquis, lessened. It was a sanctuary. Min scrambled to close the final gap in the circle, his own body the last piece to enter the safe zone, but he was too slow. As he was stepping over the line, the Maquis struck. A tendril of pure blackness, darker than the surrounding dark, shot out and wrapped around his ankle. Min cried out in pain and surprise. He fell backward, his torso and head inside the circle, but his legs trapped outside. The horde of Han-Ma, drawn to the struggle, swarmed him. Min. Emma screamed, scrambling to the edge of the circle, her hands outstretched. Stay inside, he gasped, his face a mask of agony as the spirits overwhelmed him. Finish it, Emma. The dawn. Use the dawn. She could only watch in horror as his body was enveloped by a swirling vortex of whispering shadows and a greater, more profound darkness. His screams were loud, then abruptly swallowed by the 1,000 voices of the dead. And then, he was still. His body lay just outside the circle, peaceful now, the life gone from him. He had sacrificed himself to save them. Emma was alone, huddled in a circle of faint silver light with a catatonic girl, surrounded by an army of the dead and a demon of pure shadow. She looked at Min's body, at the journal that lay open just inside the circle. Use the dawn. She picked up the book. Her flashlight revealed the final passage of the ritual. It was not a ritual of banishment. Her grandmother knew better. You could not destroy a wound this deep. You could only stitch it shut. The ritual was to reinforce the prison, to use the purifying energy of the sunrise to reseal the morgue. But it required an offering. A sacrifice of will, of spirit. A memory of purest love, willingly given, to blind the shadow with light. Her most cherished memory. The last clear one she had of her grandmother, before she had left for America. They were in the kitchen, the air thick with the smell of pandan and sticky rice. Banagwai was showing her how to fold the banana leaves for Bon Chung, her hands, wrinkled and gentle, guiding Emma's clumsy ones. Her grandmother had been laughing, her eyes sparkling with a love so pure and unconditional it felt like its own form of sunlight. That was the memory. The one she had clung to for years, the proof that she had once been loved that completely. To give it up was to sever the last, true connection to the woman she had come here to find. Tears streamed down her face. She looked at Lin, then at the bodies of Min and Tuan that lay somewhere out in the darkness. She looked at her grandmother's words. It was not a choice. It was a duty. Through the grimy, high windows of the autopsy room, the first, faint, gray light of pre-dawn began to filter in. The whispers of the Han Ma grew weaker, more sorrowful. The oppressive presence of the Ma Kui began to thin, its power tied to the absolute night. Now. It had to be now. Emma placed her hands on the Sultan bloodline of the circle. She closed her eyes, and she brought the memory to the forefront of her mind. The kitchen. The smell of pandan. The warmth of her grandmother's hands. The sound of her laughter. She held it, cherished it, felt the pure, loving warmth of it one last time, then, chanting the final words from the journal, she let it go. She pushed the memory, its emotional energy, its light, its love, out of herself and into the circle. The silver line on the floor flared with a blinding, brilliant white light. It expanded, rushing outwards from the circle like a shockwave, a silent, cleansing explosion of pure energy. It passed through the room, through the walls, through the entire morgue. As the light wave passed, the whispering Han Ma sighed and dissolved. The great, malevolent presence of the Ma Kui shrieked, a sound of frustrated rage, and was pushed back into the deepest foundations of the building, the newly reinforced seal of the prison slamming shut behind it. And then, as the first, true rays of the morning sun streamed through the windows, the light from the circle faded, the morgue was silent. Utterly and completely silent. It was just a cold, broken, empty building. The nightmare was over. Emma opened her eyes. She felt hollowed out, scoured clean. She tried to recall her grandmother's face from that day in the kitchen, but there was only a blank space, a vague sense of warmth, the details gone forever. She had paid the price. She looked over at Lin. The girl's eyes were blinking. She looked around the room, then at Emma, a flicker of confused recognition on her face. The breaking of the curse had released her mind. They were the only ones left. They had survived. Epilogue 3 weeks later, Emma stood before the chained gates of the Ton Ho morgue. The building looked smaller in the bright afternoon sun, almost pathetic, its peeling walls and broken windows a testament to a horror no one else would ever know. It was condemned, wrapped in chains and official warnings, a forgotten monument to the dead. She was wearing a simple, white aodai, the traditional mourning dress of her homeland. She felt calm. The frantic, skeptical journalist from Chicago was gone, burned away in the darkness of that night. In her place was someone quieter, older, someone who understood the weight of secrets. Lin stood a few feet behind her, her own recovery a quiet, fragile thing. They hadn't spoken much about that night. There were no words for it. But they had survived together, and that was a bond that needed no language. Emma knelt, her movements fluid and practiced. She opened a small, woven basket and carefully laid out her offerings on a piece of banana leaf before the gate. A small bowl of white rice. A ripe mango. And 3 sticks of incense. She lit the incense, the familiar, fragrant smoke curling into the humid air. She held them between her palms and bowed her head, not in prayer, but in acknowledgement. A quiet tribute to Tuan, the reluctant hero who died for a monster of the mind. To Min, the weary guardian who gave his life to protect the rules. And to Banagwai, the silent warden whose war she had finally, unwittingly, finished, she had lost her most precious memory of her grandmother, but in its place was a profound, aching understanding. She had come to Vietnam seeking answers about her grandmother's death, and she had found the meaning of her life instead. She had finally come home, placing the smoldering incense sticks in a small holder. Emma stood. She gave the morgue one last look, a silent promise to its sleeping prisoner and its resting souls. Then she turned her back on it and walked away, leaving the scent of incense to mingle with the ghosts of the banyan trees, the new guardian of Ton Hoa leaving her post, knowing she would never be truly free, but at last, finally at peace.